Cider. Some people love it, some people hate it. If you're in the latter group, you probably want to find something else to watch. Real cider, I'm not talking about Strongbow here, is a bit of a niche interest in London pubs. It's more of a rural thing and it's more associated with the traditional cider producing regions of Britain, the West Country and the West Midlands. However, if you know where to look, you can find real cider in pubs here in London. And actually CAMRA, the Campaign for Real Ale, are a big help in this regard. Although, of course, beer is their core focus, they've been doing a sideline in championing real cider and perry since the 1980s. Some local CAMRA branches give out Cider Pub of the Year awards. So I thought doing a tour of this year's winners, as chosen by the inner London CAMRA branches, would be a good way to get a taste for what the capital has to offer in terms of orchard-derived booze. First of all then, this is the winner of South West London CAMRA branch's Cider Pub of the Year for 2025. It is the Trafalgar. I'm here in Merton, quite close to Wimbledon in southwest London. The nearest tube station is South Wimbledon. Beautiful tube station, actually, really sort of Art Deco in style, some really nice old signage and other internal fixtures and fittings, but we're not here to talk about tube stations. About a 5-minute walk from there to this absolute gem of a pub. What a beautiful looking pub this is, the Trafalgar here in Merton. Let's go and see what the cider offering is like. Cheers from the Trafalgar. This is my first time here. Having looked this up online, I wasn't sure if there was any outside space, and it is wonderfully small and cosy inside, so it would have been difficult to talk to CAMRA inside without disturbing the other customers. But happily there is this garden here, which didn't see any photos of that online, so happy to discover this. What an absolute gem of a pub. What a beautiful little hanger-on when so much of the surrounding area has obviously been redeveloped. Don't know the exact age of the building, but there has been a pub on this site since the 1860s, and a lot of the internal fixtures and fittings to me looked interwar, I would say, possibly 1930s, that matchboard panelling on the bar counter with the slightly sloping sides and the curved corners, a classic from the 1930s. Some very attractive stained glass lamp covers as well, with actually filament light bulbs today. There's so many light bulbs in pubs today are turning over to LEDs. Nice to see some proper filaments for a change. Just a very, very attractive pub. And my reason for coming here, of course, is the cider selection. I believe it was just last month they were awarded the South West London CAMRA branch Cider Pub of the Year award, and they have a board by the bar that lists all of the different beer and cider offerings. There are some cask ales, some keg beers as well, and a very respectable selection of cider. I counted 5 on the board there. I started off with a Hancock's Meadow Farm Miles Orchard, I believe this particular cider is called. I think Hancock's Meadow Farm are in Herefordshire in the Wye Valley next to the River Wye. This is a dry cider, 6.5% ABV. I think that's a medium-ish colour for cider, isn't it? Not particularly light, not particularly dark. Relatively clear, not sparkling, of course. I don't really like sparkling cider. Proper traditional country cider, not sparkling. Really nice aroma of apples and apple skins. I assume this is made using traditional cider apple varieties, but it is slightly reminiscent of russet, those kind of apples with Egremont russets, those apples with that russety skin, papery skin. Paperiness, almost woodiness on the nose there. Very appley. I'm going to be using the adjective appley a lot, sorry. It's a bit unavoidable with cider. I think that has really, really nice balance for a dry cider in particular. Sometimes dry ciders can end up really quite acidic without that extra bit of sweetness to balance. And this has sort of gentle bitterness to it, almost a kind of umami, a slight savoury quality. Very appley. Can't get away from very appley, I'm afraid. A little bit of tannin, but it's all sort of in moderation, all kept in check. Really nice long aftertaste. Again, very appley. Can't really get away from apples. That is beautiful. That is a really nice start. It is exactly the sort of cider that I like. Slightly tangy, but not overly acidic. Slightly bitter and interesting, but not overwhelmingly so, not mouth-puckeringly astringent. The tannins, as I say, all kept in check. Unnervingly easy drinking for something at, what was it, 6.5%. It's a great start, really good. Next cider here at the Trafalgar. I'm working my way from dry to medium. Whether or not I'll get to the sweet, I don't know, but it seems like the correct way to do it. This is from a producer called Duck chicken. I like the sound of that. And this particular cider is called Giggle Juice. Rather flashily, it actually even has a vintage on it, 2024. Not sure of the ABV. It seemed to be missing from the chalkboard over there. And looking this up on Duck Chicken's website, does seem to vary by vintage in the 6 to 7% range. This is a producer that is, I believe, based in SW19, so they're incredibly local, and they state that they make cider in the Eastern style, as in the Southeast, Kent, etc., which I possibly omitted in the introduction. That is another historic cider producing region. So they use apples from Kentish orchards, apparently specifically apples that otherwise would have been discarded by those producers. One of the particular stylistic differences about Kentish cider, and you get this in Sussex as well, is the use of eating apples, dessert apples, the sort of apples you'd have in your fruit bowl on the table, rather than the cider-specific apple varieties that are more commonly used in the West Country, the West Midlands, and so on, those other cider-producing regions. And they also mentioned that it is wild fermented, so the only ingredients in this, as I may have said in the introduction, are apples. That's it. They haven't even introduced any commercial yeast to do the fermentation here. They've just relied on the ambient yeasts that were living on the skins of those apples. I think their own tasting notes describe the nose on this as grape-aid, which is really weird, isn't it? Sparkling grape juice, I suppose, is that? There is an almost winey quality. I'm getting what in wine terms you'd call autolytic notes, sort of yeasty, bready kind of notes on the nose, and maybe something weirdly a bit like cream soda. Not obviously appley cidery. Interesting, unusual sort of nose to that. On the palate, particularly compared to the previous one, again, this is dry in style, but I'm noticing the acidity there a bit more. It is a bit sharper, but then it is appley, and that apple character is more like eating apples. Egremont russet and Bramley's seedling. So rather than dessert apples, Bramley's, of course, is more of a cooking apple, I think, isn't it? Interesting that I was talking with that first one that it reminded me a bit of Egremont russets, or the skins of russets particularly, and that one didn't actually have any russet in, presumably, whereas this one does. So it's very fresh, quite tart, quite acidic, very juicy, quite a different apple character though. You don't really get the same sort of bitter, almost slightly savoury tannic notes that you'd get from those bittersweet or bitter sharp, those cider apple varieties. This is a little bit more about sort of acidity and freshness. I'm a bit more used to that Western style, so this might take a bit of getting used to, but I suspect if I ever moved to Kent, I would learn to love this. As noted, there are in total 5 ciders on the lineup here at the Trafalgar. I think I'm going to just stop at 3. This is the third of those 5. There are 2 there that sound like they're possibly a little bit too sort of avant-garde for my taste. One of them is Little Pomona's Sparkling Pink Cider, perhaps not my cup of tea. I think Little Pomona are a very interesting producer, and they do some very experimental, very novel things with cider, and I think they're pushing it into sort of brave new frontiers. As you may have guessed from my beer preferences, I'm a little bit more traditionalist as well when it comes to cider, but I'm happy for them that they are doing that kind of thing. Also, the other one was Against the Grains, Wood for the Trees. That might have been borderline my kind of thing, but reading some of the blurb around it sounded a little bit sort of hip as well, a little bit, as I say, avant-garde. So I have instead here gone for Harry's Haymaker, which is a medium, is it medium or possibly even medium dry? The nose on that is almost a bit like stewed apple. It has a Bramley apple pie kind of, apple pie, perhaps not Bramley, but apple pie kind of filling. Nice and soft and gentle and delicate, and there may even be hints of pastry in it. Perhaps I'm imagining that. But actually very nice balance on the palate. Really, it isn't overly sweet at all. It's medium, I think medium dry might be the right description for this. There is a little tiny little twinge of sweetness, as I say, just to give it some balance. Nice, big, full sort of appley flavour to it. Sugar often helps fruit characters to be more identifiable, I think. And there's a really satisfying fullness to the mouthfeel. It's mouth-filling, excites all parts of the palate there. I really like that, actually. It would be hard-pressed for me to come up with a favourite between this and the first one. The second, perhaps not a style I'm so accustomed to, so as I say, something I perhaps need to, a taste I might need to acquire, but this is actually very, very nice. It is a bit less dry, A bit less bitter, a bit less tannic, a little bit less astringent than the first one. Although I don't think the first one was overly so in any of those categories. This is a very, very easy drinking cider. Really very, very quaffable. I think still within an acceptable boundary for me of not too sweet. Medium, but possibly medium dry. Harry's cider is from somewhere near Long Sutton in Somerset. It's somewhere in between Yeovil and Taunton. I'm delighted to see that that was part of the lineup. So I think we've covered the three main areas here in this first pub. We've had something from the West Midlands, that Herefordshire region, something from the West Country proper. Sometimes Herefordshire gets included in the West Country, doesn't it? I think that's possibly open for debate. And we've had something from the southeast, something from Kent. I would be slightly hard put to come up with a favourite from the first or the third. Possibly depends on my mood. I suspect this is something I could drink more of without starting to feel a little bit under assault from. I love the taste of dry ciders, but they are, generally pretty acidic, pretty tannic, and after a while a bit of fatigue can set in. So this is certainly something I think you could make more of a session out of, probably. Well, that's been great. I really enjoyed coming to the Trafalgar. What an absolute gem of a pub. I assume this was a former beer house. Today, of course, it has a full license. They sell spirits and so on if you are into that kind of thing. But it really has the feeling of wonderfully sort of basic, down-to-earth pub that at some point in history presumably would have been a beer-only license. Who knows? Maybe even in the 1860s they were doing a little bit of cider on the side, brought in from Kent. Today, very, very appealing cider lineup. 5 ciders, 2 of those very much enjoyed. Beautiful pub. It's a little bit out of the way here in Merton, if you're not already in South London, but it is very close to the tube station, as I probably said earlier. 5-minute walk from South Wimbledon Tube on the Northern Line. Lovely pub, Trafalgar. Really enjoying the cider selection here. Cheers for now. Next up, we have the winner of South East London CAMRA Branch's Cider Pub of the Year. This is the Victoria, not far from Borough Station, I suppose, or Elephant and Castle. There are good bus routes from Bricklayers Arms, connecting Bricklayers Arms near here, and it's near to Old Kent Road. This is a pub that I have featured before, quite recently, on that video about pubs near the Old Kent Road. So I'm not going to talk too much about the building itself. It is a beautiful pub in a spectacular location with one of the nicest landlords in all of London. But it also has a fantastic cider selection, as if those things weren't enough. I have the great privilege of being joined here by Pat, who has to be one of the nicest landlords of any London pub. So thank you very much, Pat, for...
Well, you're being very, very kind.
I think we're on the brink of an august occasion. You're receiving the CAMRA Pub of the Cider Pub of the Year.
Yes.
From South East London CAMRA branch.
That's correct.
So I think the timing of my visit is quite apt.
Yes, I have to say quite honestly that I was totally unaware of this. It was one of our friends, Carla, who's a Hash House Harrier runner, that came in about 3 Fridays ago, and she said, "Oh, what about that? You're winning an award." And I said, I was totally unaware. A little bit like when we were told that we were awarded one of the top 50 pubs in London through Time Out because a girl came in. So yeah, I'm not always up to speed with these sort of things. So yeah, I was quite surprised, and I was extremely flattered that there's an awful lot of places that are far more august than us, and it was nice for us to get or to be getting this award.
Right. Yeah. It is a great selection. I was looking at the list just now. Is it about 10 different ciders?
I think we've got about 10 at the moment.
10 different ciders.
Yes.
So you've been telling me now, just off camera, how the cider thing developed here. Perhaps you could let the viewers at home know a little bit of the history of how you came to it.
Yeah, well, basically my father came from Bristol. The way he spoke about ciders and scrumpy and things like that, and the old stories of rats falling into the cider stills and
all the best ciders
yes.
like that.
And anecdotes about Canadians and drinking cider. They got just completely comatose by it, and somehow it just seemed right. I don't know how I kind of got into it. There's a friend of ours called Richard, who's an amateur historian but also a real cider buff, and he started talking to me, and we started investigating different ciders, and I have to say Lily's have been very, very good, and I've been trying different ones from sweet, which is peach, to some of the really drier ones, but we try and keep so that they're not too strong. So it's important that people understand that if we've got a box on the bar, they don't assume that, oh, scrumpy, that's going to get you legless after a pint. So it's been a learning curve for us as well.
Yeah. Do you have a particular favourite, or has it changed sort of over time?
Richard would not think, he doesn't really see it as so, but the elderflower is quite crisp. It's easy to drink, and it's about 3.5. But there are ones that are very favourites here, like Slack McGirdle. We've got Devon Red. We do Fire Dance and things like that. But there's varying ones, and of course we've got Peach, which is very sweet. And you have to explain to some of the customers that they're not drinking peach juice. It is still cider, and they will eventually feel the effects. And a friend of ours who's since passed, I had the boxes on the bar, and they were just purely the boxes, and he actually made wooden boxes and try to make them antique, and that has kind of not made it, as my brother used to say, you seem to have like an Amazon DHL depot here on a...
Cider normally comes in cardboard boxes, doesn't it?
That's right.
Rather than barrels, or it's a sort of bag-in-box setup business.
And we've got a beautiful 66 foot of hardwood bar top, and he felt it was a little bit of a desecration. And one thing I haven't said to Mr. Tweedy here is that when my brother said to me, so you're going to leave those boxes there, are you? And you think they're going to sell? And as luck would have it, this group came through the door, and it was almost as if I'd paid them, and they walked in and said, oh, this is the pub that does ciders. Oh, you've got this and you've got that. And my brother held his hands up and he went, I'll go with it then.
And it's such a beautiful location. It's only my second time here, but just the sight of it as you walk down Painter's Walk, it's in such a beautiful setting. You have this outdoor seating. The summer is now upon us, finally.
Yeah.
And I would struggle to think of a better place in London to drink cider than here at the Victoria. So thank you, Pat. I really appreciate you taking a bit of time out of your day to talk to us. And I hope I don't need to persuade you anymore. This is an absolutely spectacular pub. Even if you don't like cider, there's very good beer offering and plenty of other drinks on the bar as well. So.
Thank you very much indeed. That's very, very kind of you.
Thank you. Cheers.
I'm afraid.
Cheers.
Cheers.
I've been having an incredibly nice time here at the Victoria, chatting to Pat, and I'm sort of forgetting about the cider a little bit. I've been enjoying the cider while I've been talking to Pat, but I should be doing some cider tasting notes. So this is Sanford Reserve. Quite punchy. It's, I think, 7.3% ABV. And perhaps partly because Pat has been talking a little bit about Calvados and how that sort of factors into the story of how cider ended up a fixture here at the Victoria. I almost feel like there is a slightly sort of Calvados-y, brandy-esque nose there. A little bit of brown sugar, that kind of thing. Beautifully smooth on the palate. I think this is a medium. Definitely not overly sweet, but it does have a really nice, pleasant edge of sweetness to it. Really nice balance, bit of acidity. Quite a full, appley flavour. It's very difficult to come up with adjectives other than apples. Again, quite deceptive. You wouldn't know that was 7.3%. And I'm glad to be having it in a half in something that is pretty much a wine glass, because this is, after all, the wine of the West, as Westerns used to call it. A little bit of a darker colour, a little bit more sort of browny orange, fruity, smooth, rich, very, very pleasant. No rough edges to that at all. Sanford is a cider producer from Devon. They're somewhere near Crediton. I think that makes it mid-Devon, doesn't it? And all their apples come from old Devon orchards. I think that's absolutely lovely. I think you can get this stuff in bottles as well, but of course the bottled version always has a little bit of carbonation, sort of gentle carbonation, whereas this is wonderfully still. Almost slightly honeyed there now. Getting a hint of something like honey on the nose. Moving on to Slack McGirdle. This is also from Sanford. It's 5.8% ABV, and it takes its name from an apple variety. That I think that is an indigenous Devon apple variety, Slack McGirdle. Although this is actually a blend, it's not a single varietal, there are other apples in here as well. It's a little bit drier than the Sanford Reserve, a bit fresher, a bit fruitier, more appley, possibly some other fruit character in there. I think the official tasting notes talk about citrus. Really getting that. I think, to me, this is firmly in the territory of apples, and I'm happy about that. I don't need it to taste of anything but apples. Again, lovely. It has a roundness, juiciness, freshness to it, really good balance. This must be a medium dry-ish, but there's definitely no bitterness or tannin or astringency here. It's very easy drinking. Perhaps a bit more of a session cider than the other one, given the strength. Very, very good stuff. I did earlier also try a cider from One Tree Hill. I don't think that was on the list, which was wonderfully sort of light, almost an ethereal sort of cider. Really nice. Didn't get a chance to do full tasting notes for that because I was having a fascinating chat with Pat, the landlord. You could very happily sit and while away a few hours here in the spectacular outside space at the Victoria, enjoying their incredible cider selection, or indeed the beer selection, which is also very good. What a spectacular pub. Cheers. Next up, we have the Chesham Arms in Hackney, not far from Hackney Central Station. This was the winner of the 2025 Cider Pub of the Year for the East London and City branch of CAMRA. So here at the Chesham Arms, there were 4 still ciders on tap, 2 from Ross on Wye, which is a producer that I really like. This is the first one I'm starting with. It's quite dry. It's called Spring Came Early. I think the ABV was 6.5 possibly. This is a mixture of 2 cider apple varieties, Dabinet, which makes up about 80% of the blend, and the other one is called Browns, is it? Dabinet is a bittersweet. It's a very, very good cider apple. My dad uses Dabinet sometimes in some of his homemade cider. This has got that really lovely sort of barnyardy smell. You sometimes encounter that in other drinks. You get it occasionally in wine even. I think it is a product of Brettanomyces, a naturally occurring yeast indigenous to Britain. That's the name, Brettanomyces. Here it gives you this, I mean, it doesn't smell like, I'm not saying it smells like manure, but it's got this lovely sort of rural, rustic, farmyardy sort of smell in a nice way. And then again, it reminds me of apples with particularly papery, russety skins, a bit like that first one at the Trafalgar. Really dry, but I'm not finding it unpleasantly so. There's definitely a fair amount of tannin there, getting that sort of slight gentle mouth puckering feel, but again I don't think that's over the top. Quite light in terms of mouthfeel, apart from that tannic, you know, the sensation of tannins that you're familiar with from perhaps drinking black tea. And beyond that, a very fruity twang. I wouldn't say it's particularly sharp. Acidic is not the word that comes to mind, but more tangy. It's got an apple tang to it, and quite a long lingering finish as well. And that's partly something you get from any kind of drink that is a little bit tannic. That seems to sort of persist on the palate a bit longer. They've served this relatively chilled, and I actually think that is a good decision on a day like today. I think we're heading up to 28 degrees Celsius, so I'm glad of this being a little bit on the chilled side. That is overall just very, very nice, I think. It's dry, but it's fruity, it's refreshing, it's got a tang to it, a twang or a tang, and an amount of tannin. I'm not the world's biggest fan of tannin, but in that sort of dose it makes it kind of interesting, and I think the word wine connoisseurs uses something like grippy, isn't it? Never quite figured out what that means, but lovely stuff. Proper, very rural, very rustic cider there. Very happy with that. I feel I should say a few words about the pub. It is one that I am not familiar with, and I'm really taken with it. I'm obviously particularly pleased because it's got some fantastic cider on tap, but I did do a video previously, some of you may remember, about Hackney pubs, and I have to say, perhaps I came here in the wrong frame of mind, but I wasn't overall that impressed with what I saw in Hackney on that particular visit. But this is an absolute gem. I wish I had come here and it might have changed my entire perception of Hackney. It obviously has been a little bit sort of tarted up around the edges, but it is retaining, I think, still a very pubby feel, and it has some interesting old features. One of the chaps behind the bar said that some wallpaper in one of the corridors off to the side of the bar there could even be original from the Victorian era. Certainly looks of a considerable age to me. Really pleased with this. What a great pub, and I wish I'd come here before when I was doing that Hackney pubs video. Moved on to the second cider here at the Chesham Arms. This is called Mighty Red Apples, and it's also from Ross on Wye Cider and Perry. I don't know if we're actually going to get to any perry during this this video. I hope we'll see some perry. I will try it as soon as I find some. So this doesn't have that barnyardy sort of aroma of the first one. Slightly floral, and yet also at the same time slightly reminding me of a ploughman's lunch. A big chunk of cheese and some pickle. which doesn't sound particularly appetising, but I love ploughman's lunches, so it works for me. It's 6% ABV, a little bit lower than the previous one. I think the style of this, again, is dry. Again, there's some use of browns here, but also Ellis Bitter, which is another bittersweet, but this actually seems to come out slightly sharper, I would say, than the previous one. I think they describe it as medium acidity. It's certainly not extremely acidic, but I'm noticing a little bit more sharpness than the previous cider. Tannins there, probably similar. I think their characterization is medium tannin, which is about a good level for me. I think anything with high tannin I would find a bit too much. Medium, just about right. So I'm getting a little bit of that kind of mouth coating, slightly sort of mouth puckering sensation, but not a huge amount. Hard to describe the fruit character there as anything other than appley, but in a pleasant way. Again, I'm slightly drawn to thinking about ploughman's lunches. Perhaps I'm just hungry, I don't know, but quite often a ploughman's lunch has an apple served on the side, and a particular sort of flavour of the apple after you've been eating some cheese and pickles and chutney. Somehow slightly reminiscent of that. Very nice. I think I found the first one a bit easier to drink because the acidity was slightly lower. Generally speaking, I like acidity, but you know, occasionally, eventually can get a little bit too much. But that is another very fine cider, quite happy with that. The third cider here at the Chesham Arms is Hogan's Libertine, and look at that colour. As the name Libertine suggests, they've played somewhat fast and loose with the traditional rules of cider making, and I'm not sure if this would qualify for CAMRA's definition of real cider, because it has additives in it above and beyond just apples. But for once, I'm going to say to hell with the rules, because this is actually delicious. I think there might be something like muscovado sugar added to this, so that would break the rule of CAMRA's real cider, which can't be chaptalized. I don't know if that counts as chaptalization, adding muscovado sugar. I don't know if it's for fermentation or just afterwards. And you can smell that on the nose. It's got a lovely brown sugar, dark sugar smell. And I think one of the tasting note I read for this suggested something like toffee apple, which is, yeah, I think I get that sort of fairground toffee apples. So it is still very appley, but there is something sweet and slightly toffee-ish on the nose. I may be sacrificing my credentials as a purist when it comes to booze, but that is just very nice. What can I say? And then on the palate, it is surprisingly well balanced for something which I believe has actually been deliberately sweetened. So they must have started with a very dry and quite acidic cider and then added that muscovado to it. So this is definitely not one for the purists. I'm sure there'll be people out there turning their nose up at this, but it's delicious. What can I say? You know, really nice balance. It really helps to express the fruit. I think I probably said earlier in the video, I think sugar is important for actually understanding fruit character. We're used to most fruit being relatively sweet, and without sugar, fruit character does tend to get a bit lost in the noise. So a lovely, soft, yeah, toffee apple sort of flavour, I suppose. I mentioned earlier the West Midlands in general is one of the traditional cider producing regions, and in particular we think of the three counties, Herefordshire, Worcestershire and Gloucestershire. But I think there is also traditionally some cider making in the neighbouring counties, including, I believe this is actually Warwickshire, not too far from Stratford-on-Avon, somewhere like Alcester, is it? I'm probably mispronouncing that. The purist within me is slightly reeling at this, but the rest of me is saying this is just actually very nice, so shut up and enjoy it. I've had a very pleasant time here at the Chesham Arms, and it has been a bit of a road to Damascus style experience. I came here a little bit reluctant, if I'm honest, to come to Hackney. Haven't had a great time at the pubs here before, but this pub has changed my mind that there is at least one thoroughly decent pub here with some really excellent cider. And again, this has also been quite Damascean, what's the word? Damascusian, I don't know what, there is a word for it, isn't there? Next, here we are in leafy Crouch Hill, next to the overground station just here, and the pub which has won CAMRA's North London Cider Pub of the Year is the Robin behind me. I have covered this pub before in a video on Crouch End, but here we are again to see what the cider offering is like. Cheers from the Robin. A bit of a difficult place to film, all of the outside tables currently taken. If the cider lineup here looks a bit familiar to any of you who know the Southampton Arms, that is of course because Nick, the boss of this fine establishment, was at one time the manager at the Southampton Arms, which is not a million miles away, only a couple of stops on the overground from here to Gospel Oak. 4 ciders on tap, it seems, today on the hand pumps behind the bar. Started off with what looked to be the driest. This is Oliver's. They're from somewhere in Herefordshire. I think they're actually relatively close to Hereford. There isn't a lot written on their website about this particular cider. I think the ABV is 6.2, possibly 6.3, and they just describe it as a blend of bittersweet and sharp varieties. I would say yes, it is reasonably sharp, reasonably tangy, bit of bitterness, bit of complexity there. It's doing what it says on the tin in terms of bittersweet, sharp cider apples. In fact, possibly that's one of the sharpest I've encountered yet so far today. It is fairly high on the acidity. Again, sort of farmyardy aromas. There is a hint of sort of cider vinegar there and hay, almost something slightly smoky as well. And of course apples. Quite a lot of acidity. I think you're going to have to be in the mood for something relatively tart, relatively sharp to enjoy this. Found a slightly quieter spot possibly, although we also have background music to contend with now. This is second I'm going to try here. Possibly I'll only go for 2 here because the other 2 looked a bit sweet. This is Luke's Vintage Cider. It's 6.4%. It's categorized as a medium. I think I get on with that better actually than the first one. I think that extra little bit of sweetness helps to counteract the acidity there. I felt perhaps the first one, for me, surprisingly, I normally like acidic things, but I found that a little bit too tart. This is a bit of an enigma, Luke's Cider. There is a tap room for this business in Walthamstow, of all places. I don't think the actual production, the actual cider making takes place in Walthamstow. And there is just a slightly cryptic note on the website that Luke has a family farm in the West Country, but doesn't specify where exactly. So could be Somerset, could even be Herefordshire, as that sometimes does get characterised as the West Country. So we don't know much about this, but there's a much more easy drinking cider. Something slightly rustic on the nose, still reassuringly quite traditional, quite farmyardy. A nice sweet apple aroma, possibly a bit of background of hay and straw and all the rest. And it does have that extra bit of sweetness on the palate, which I actually think really helps after the first one. Sort of almost brownish colour there, isn't it? Which is not necessarily a bad thing. Pretty low on tannins, not particularly bitter either. Quite a nice balance of sweet and sour actually on the palate. I like that. The marketing material for Luke's, some of it veers, to my taste, a bit dangerously close to the sort of brightly coloured, almost infantile cans you see in craft beer. But the flavour of that is very much, to me, a traditional West Country cider. Also, there is a note on the website that it uses natural yeast, natural ambient yeast. So this is a very pure cider, I'm led to believe. It's good stuff. That's going to be all from the Robin, just 2 quick halves there. The heat is getting to me a bit, to be honest, but it is a very interesting pub, very unique, quirky, eclectic sort of a pub, well worth a visit. There is one last CAMRA branch covering what I would consider to be inner London, and that's West London. They cover the city of Westminster, Kensington and Chelsea, and Hammersmith and Fulham. They don't currently award a cider pub of the year, so I'm going to pick one myself in this area, and the obvious choice is that old stalwart of cider in London, the Harp, just a stone's throw from Trafalgar Square, not far from Charing Cross Station. I have a book published in 2010 titled The Naked Guide to Cider, which has a chapter, a short one, providing advice to cider drinkers who find themselves stranded in London. After somewhat flippantly advising that they just move to Bristol, it does provide a couple of recommendations for pubs and bars at that time, which had at least a bit of a cider selection, and one of those was the Harp here. So I think for that reason, if nothing else, they deserve a mention here in the video. 15 years of carrying the torch of cider here in London. Cheers from the Harp. Not an easy pub to do any filming at. It's always a bit busy in here, and there isn't much outside space either. There were 4 ciders and perries on the cider and perry board. Actually 4 just ciders. I was hoping to finally find a perry. We don't seem to have had much luck with that on this video, but perhaps another time. The first one, I'm going to start again with the driest, is from Ross on Wye, so that's continuing that theme from the Chesham Arms earlier. It's 6.8% ABV. It's a bit similar stylistically to those two that I had at the Chesham Arms. Subtle kind of barnyardy sort of smell. Apple skins again, the usual sort of, the usual things you'd expect from rustic cider. It is pretty dry, but it's really nicely balanced. It's certainly not searingly acidic, definitely not over the top. It's got that nice, slightly savoury quality. I really like that in cider when they have a subtle hint of umami, a sort of, I don't know where that comes from. It's obviously some facet of the particular type of bitter sharp, bitter sweet apples that they use. Nice little piquant bitter notes in there. Little tingly bits of tannin, but that's again pretty much kept in check. I don't think it's gone over the top. The name is interesting, isn't it? I couldn't look up the apple varieties. I don't seem to have a signal in here. Perhaps I'll put that on screen if I can find that out later. Challenging lighting here. Moved on to the second on the list here. This is Moon's Cider. Not a producer I'm familiar with, but I have managed to get my phone working so I can look at what it says on the internet about it. I don't have the ABV here, but I do have the apple blend. It is Harry Master's Jersey, one my dad uses in his homemade cider sometimes. Improved Dove, I like the sound of that. Michelin and Browns. We encountered some Browns earlier, didn't we? I have found the ABV here. It's a 5%. Again, these medium ciders always seem to have a softer sort of apple aroma to them. Tiny bit more like cooked apple. That's quite nice. Gentle but pleasant. Nicely balanced on the palate. Hint of richness to that, I would say. A little bit more body to it somehow. Not much in terms of bitterness or tannins. Just actually very easygoing, easy drinking cider. It's very pleasant, actually. Can we find out where they're from? I do like to know the origins of these. Found it now. They're in Somerset, actually not far from Glastonbury, which is topical, as I think that's on at the moment as I'm filming this. Not really a huge amount to say about it. It's not particularly extreme in any dimension, but it's just very pleasant, easy drinking, quite traditional, but not particularly barnyardy. I would imagine they've used commercial yeast here rather than wild yeast because it doesn't have any of that funk you get from Brettanomyces and Chums. But it's very nice, very pleasant, very easy to drink. Could easily have a couple more of those. I was considering stopping after the first two because they seemed like the ones that would more reliably be to my taste. But I thought I would push on to the third. They're getting progressively sweeter as we move down the list. This is from Hogan's, who we encountered earlier at the Chesham Arms. Interesting amount of duplication in the producers we're seeing in the latter half of this tour. This is Hazy Rays. As you can see, it's quite a hazy cider. As we found with that Hogan cider, the what was it called, Libertine at the Chesham Arms, I'm not sure this would make the definition for CAMRA's real cider. It actually has ingredients listed on the website, so whether or not this is a real cider or not, I'm not sure. It's 3.9% ABV, and I think the style was described as medium sweet. It does have some official tasting notes, which suggests there's a hint of citrus. I'm not sure I'm getting that. I would say apples, but actually veering ever so slightly tropical somehow here. Almost a hint of, I don't know, something like pineapple, mango, something like that. But it's predominantly apple, though. And on the palate, that is really light, really easygoing. Doesn't actually taste excessively sweet. There is a decent amount of acidity there, a decent amount of juice and freshness. It's actually very juicy. It's reminding me of some kind of fruit juice that just happens to be a bit alcoholic. It's a relatively low ABV by cider standards. Yeah, it really does have a mouthfeel and a taste that is quite reminiscent of fairly fresh fruit juice. And I mean fresh as in not yet turned into alcohol. It's chilled. All of the ones here are out of the fridge, which I'm glad of. You probably noticed from my unkempt attire that this is a very hot day. I think we're getting up to about 32 degrees Celsius today. So alas, hashtag too hot for tweed. For once, a sort of chilled, very light, very easygoing cider is actually not an unwelcome thing. So this is definitely not something I would enjoy in the depths of winter in front of a crackling open fire. But in these circumstances, in the height of summer, it's all right. It is too hot for this. I need to get back to my damp, squalid Victorian hovel and cool off a bit. But that's going to be it for today's tour of London cider pubs. As I've probably already said, there are obviously far more pubs in London than the 5 that I've mentioned here that serve real cider and perry. It's a shame we didn't get to any perry, hopefully on a future outing. Maybe that'll be a video all by itself. So as I say, go and look at CAMRA's fantastic pub guide online. You can search for pubs that serve real cider there, and the other branches and their Cider Pub of the Year awards, all fertile ground for finding excellent pubs serving cider here in London. Thanks very much for watching, and I will see you on the next one. Bye bye.